I've been hearing a lot of talk about them red beaky boys and how fighty they is. But everyone knows that Orcs is best. Our boss is getting a new coat of paint today, so let's get to the crumping.
In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I painted up the Ork Warboss in Mega Armour and his little Gretchen assistant from the Orcs Combat Patrol box, and covering a few things like battle damage and just how to paint an intimidatingly large miniature. Let's get to the war! By which I of course mean Warflesh base paint. I'm going to be starting with this thinned down on my palette, and I'm going to apply 2 thin coats of this to my Warboss. Now I'm using a hairdryer in order to speed up the process in between. And then coming on to my next layer, which is a 50-50 mix of Warboss green and Warflesh. I'm going to be applying this over 95% of what I've just painted, and you might be like, what's the point? But it's in order to make sure that we have that darker colour in the recesses. I'm starting with the face, as that's where I'm going to spend most of the time on my model, but I then do duplicate all of this on the rest of the green flesh as well. Make sure to pick out things like the fingers, as well as the grot on his shoulders. Coming back to the main head of my Warboss, I'm going to now do inside the mouth. I'm mixing up Screamer Pink along with my Warboss green and Warflesh mix. This will give me a sort of pinkish greenish colour, which is what I'm imagining the mouth of an orc might look like. I'm following a similar premise to something I mentioned in a previous video, link up here, where we're starting from the deepest layers because they're going to be tricky to get our paintbrush into, and then we're going to paint layers on top as we go through the paint job. So the mouth is about the deepest area of this orc that I can paint. I'm going to get that first and then move on to the teeth. As he's a bad moon, this guy's probably going to have very fast growing teeth, but I still don't think that he's going to take very good care of them. So I'm mixing up brown with wraithbone in order to give him a sort of gross, grotty, rotted tooth appearance. Taking care with my fine detail brush, I'm going to now make sure that I get a little bit of this paint onto each of the teeth. Make sure not to overload your brush, as it can quite easily run into the skin and the mouth that you've already painted. You'll see I'm starting from a darker colour than I'm expecting them to be at the end here, so that I can highlight them up, and it saves me having to go over with a shade, which again might run into areas that I don't want it. I then added some pure Screamer Pink back to the tongue, just to bring up that pinkness, and then added in a little bit of Wraithbone here, just to lighten it up for a highlight colour. I did the same thing with the teeth, mixing in a bit of Wraithbone into my previous brown tooth colour, more Wraithbone into the mix, and then just doing another highlight layer, again just focusing around the sharp edges of the teeth. Next, it was time for pure Warboss green, and this was going over most of the flesh, especially in the flat areas and any raised surfaces. Again, avoiding the recesses that I'd left from my previous colours. Next, I added Scarsnick green into the mix, mixing it together with my Warboss green in order to get a really light colour. I was using this to pick out the areas where the light might catch on the model. You can see here I'm doing the tops of the muscles, also the forehead and the tops of the ears, and the tops of the fingers as well. Just have a think about where light might catch on your models and try and avoid getting any of this paint into your recesses. To finish off the skin, I just took pure Scarsnick green and I tried to focus this around the very pointiest areas of things like the face. Really focus on the face here, because there's normally a lot of sculpted details like scars and things like that that you can quite easily miss. If you focus on the face, it doesn't matter if you miss it on other places, because everyone's attention is going to be immediately drawn to that face. I always tend to run out of steam towards the end of a painting project, so I always like to do this as early as possible. So that's the skin mostly done, but there's a few little touch-ups that I want to make here. One of the keys to getting really good looking faces on models is contrast. Because they're such tiny areas, you have to make sure that you've got really dark colours and really light colours in just the right places. I'm going to address this by adding orc flesh contrast paint into things like the nostrils and the inside of the ears on my Warboss's face. With that done, I'm now going to move on to start painting the armour of our orc. I'm going to be painting yellow and black as the colours for this particular boy, just because it's going to be a part of my girlfriend's orc army, and she tends to play either Bad Moons or Goffs, so it'd be nice for her to be able to slot him in either one. I'm starting with the yellow sections of the armour, particularly the area around his face. I want to draw people's attention to this, and in order to make sure that my yellow goes on smoothly, I'm actually base coating it with Wraithbone. This paint has really good coverage and then just allows the thinner, less covering yellow paints to go over the top nice and easily in a couple of layers. Speaking of which, let's move on to those yellow layers, starting with Avalanche Sunset. As you can see, with just a single layer, I've got a really nice yellow coat on the top of his armour here. This is a big advantage of doing it Wraithbone first, particularly as I'm going over a black undercoat. At this point, I'm adding some Uriel yellow and mixing about 50-50 with my Avalanche Sunset to give me a brighter yellow colour that again I'm going to focus on the upward facing armour panels. In particular here, I'm focusing on the shoulder pad and the area that kind of contains his head. Now it's on to pure Uriel yellow for an edge highlights. I'm starting off with the easy wins, as I like to call them. This area right at the top, just above his head, is definitely going to be catching a lot of sunlight, so I'll focus particularly around the corner there. But then I'll also make sure to add a few little dings and scratches in using this very light paint, as it's very unlikely that the edge of this orc's armour is going to be completely unscathed. Good paint jobs should tell stories, and battle damage can be a really important aspect of this. In any kind of warfare, but particularly in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, this warboss would have taken his fair share of hard knocks at the head of a greenskin horde rampaging around the galaxy. By adding in a few chips and scratches, using Uriel yellow with Rhinox hide to indicate shadows, your mind can start racing to all the spectacular battles he might have fought, and all the enemies that he's slain. Another thing that orcs are renowned for are their dags and checks. I'm going to be adding some dags to his shoulder pad here, using the black that I'm having as a secondary armour colour. To start off with, I'm taking my Abaddon black and thinning it down so that it flows neatly off of my fine detail brush, and just drawing the outline of some triangular, jaggedy shapes onto this shoulder pad. Once I've got my outline, I'm going to fill in the blanks and fill out the triangles with that Abaddon black. Continuing with the battle damage, I'm next going to add some Vallejo gunmetal to the really deep scratches where I think that there would be actual bare metal showing through the paint job. Use this sparingly as you don't want it to overwhelm your paint job. I think I had to go back in here and just kind of readjust and put back on a couple of layers of yellow. I also went back in with Rhinox hide to kind of reinforce the shadows that might appear around those deep bullet holes. Next, I started picking out some details on the shoulder pad. On this guy, I'm kind of working around in a clockwise direction, taking little bits at a time. It's a good way for you to break up your paint job so you don't feel overwhelmed by how much you have to do. I'm using Vallejo metal copper on this particular part of the shoulder pad, just because I thought that the sort of reddish hue of the copper is going to set off against the yellow and the black. I then applied everyone's favourite liquid talent, Agrax Earthshade, over this particular detail, making sure to get the areas underneath it where it meets the shoulder pad, as well as at the bottom of each of the little spikes. I decided that due to the vagaries of orcish engineering, he'd probably spot welded this onto his armour. To do this, I added dots of pure silver to where this particular area might be attached to the armour panel. And then I used some shades in order to give it a sort of welded effect. I used a red and a purple shade because that's the sort of colours that you might see in welded metal. I painted up a few of the other metal details, and one thing I'd recommend is always mix up your different metals as much as you can. It's just going to help to give the realistic effect that there are different metals for different purposes on your model. With the shoulder pad completed, I decided it was time to tackle the eyes. I first went in with a sort of dark brown colour similar to what I first put on the teeth, before then going over it with Wraithbone. From here, this provided me with a solid base to put over a Mephiston red layer. I'm going to have them with glowy, angry red eyes. I think that seems appropriate. Once I was done with this Mephiston red layer, I also added a bit of Uriel yellow into the mix to give a sort of orange centre to the eye. While I still had some metal paints on my palette, I decided to just cover the metals on his face. I was also coming towards the end of a session of painting, so I just kind of wanted to have the face and shoulder pad done. I used a similar method here, and when highlighting them up, I made sure to use jagged edge highlights just to again sell the fact that these are battered pieces of metal that have been attached to the face of an Ork Warboss. And so this is where he was sitting after my first day, about 4 hours in. At the start of day 2, I decided to finish off his sort of torso armour by picking out any details that I had missed, starting with this skull that he kind of has on his chest. I'm doing this with a gold colour, and then also doing a copper colour for the little symbol underneath on his belt buckle. I went over both of these with Agrex's Earthshade, and I'm going to leave them pretty much there, with a few little highlights of silver on the edges, because I'm not wanting to bring too much attention to them as they're underneath his whopping great chopper. I next wanted to focus on his trousers. These got painted with a layer of Celestra Grey mixed with Eshin Grey and a little bit of black, so that I kind of had a sort of blue-ish grey colour. I added in a bit more Celestra Grey and used this on the areas where the light would catch a bit more on the trousers. I next did a bit of a glaze, incorporating a bit more Eshin Grey, just to kind of smooth out the transition between those two colours. And next, I blocked out the shadows using again that sort of Eshin Grey with a little bit of black mixed in. Don't worry if you go overboard at this stage, we're going to be highlighting back up over the top of this. I'm going back to my Celestra Grey, which I've still got sitting on the wet palette, just to bring back up the brightness a touch. Now in order to get a contrast not just of colour but also of texture, I'm doing a bit of cross-hatching here. To do this, I'm just taking my small detail brush and drawing tiny little lines along where I've previously had the Celestra Grey. This should help give the appearance of rough cloth, showing that the light is not reflecting evenly off of all of the areas like it might with a bright armour panel. If the effect is a little too bright, you can dull it back down by glazing with darker colours. In this case, I'm using my Celestra Grey Eshin Grey mix. Be sure to get the areas of cloth poking out the side and the back as well. For his loincloth at the front, I wanted to use a similar method. This time the colours I used were Rhinox Hide, Mournfang Brown, Scrag Brown and Wraithbone. I used a similar method using my Wraithbone to get a lighter and lighter colour in order to get the highlights, and using my darker colours like my Rhinox Hide to establish my shadows. I used similar cross-hatching methods on the most raised areas just to indicate that this wasn't perfectly smooth. At this point, I decided to block out the rest of my black armour. It's sometimes a good idea to do this when you've painted individual details, just to see how they look in the context of the wider model. And so this is how he's looking with session number 2 in the books. I'm pretty happy with the centre of the model, and now we can start to branch out towards the limbs and the weapons. So for the third session, I decided to start with the metal areas on the leg armour. I'm just going around these with Vallejo gunmetal, just to give them a little pop of colour, again to give me some context to what I'm going to paint later on. And the next step is actually quite a big one, it's highlighting up the black armour. I'm using Eshin Grey first off, doing quite a thick edge highlight, making sure again to highlight the battle damage just as we did on the sort of carapace around the head. Don't worry about being too neat here, you can always come back in and clean up with Abaddon Black later down the line. I mixed some Wraithbone into my Eshin Grey and used this for my second layer of highlights, which I was a bit more sparing with, focusing on the areas which would catch the light most, and the tops of things like the battle damage. One final paintbrush full of Wraithbone gave me a very light final highlight colour, which I used to provide some scratches in the armour, as well as focusing on the very corners of all the armour panels. I decided to pick out a few details here, this time using Vallejo Air Metallic Rust. It's really important to keep mixing up your metallic colours. I purchased these Vallejo Air Metallic paints in a set a while back off of Amazon, and I've never looked back. They're really great for just providing different colours of metal across your models. I painted up the little pistons on his legs using corn red. I then highlighted these up using Mephiston Reds, before then dulling them back down with Agrax Earthshade, as I didn't want them to stand out too much and take over the rest of the model. Again, in the interest of storytelling, what I decided to do is deliberately allow some Agrax Earthshade to drip onto his trousers. This was giving the impression that wherever he'd sourced these pistons from, they were leaking, and they were leaking badly, but he didn't even really seem to care, as they help his snazzy suit function. I doubled down on this effect by getting the Vallejo Air Metallic Rust colour involved and dribbling it down the armour panel on the front of his leg, and then also got a bit of Typhus Corrosion just to really show where it's really gummed up the works. I next painted up all of the wires that are connecting up his suit in various orcish configurations. I painted these in a variety of colours, trying to keep it as random looking as possible. One thing I would recommend is if you're painting hazard stripes, paint the yellow first and then paint black over the top. Again, I used my trick where I painted Wraithbone before I put on my yellow layer, just to make sure I got really even, nice coverage. To accentuate the yellow colour, I added in Cassandora Yellow, which is a shade paint. This has a lot of orange hues, so it really helps to bring out that yellow, and it's also a different shade of yellow to what I'd used on the yellow armour. I finished off the hazard stripes by using Citadel Ard Coat to make this look like it was a bit more of a glossy wire on his back. Whenever I paint, when I start moving on to a new area, I start to then look back at the other areas I've painted in context and see if they need any more work done. In this case, I decided that the leather wasn't standing out enough, and it wasn't looking uneven enough either for the sort of grubby paint job. I decided to go in with Skaven Blight Dinge and just add another layer of cross-hatching. And similarly, I decided the trousers needed another layer, so again I went in with my Celestra Grey just to give a bit more cross-hatching back. It was now time to move on to a centerpiece of the back of the model. This kind of big engine piece I decided was going to be a big rust bucket, kind of really leaning into that ramshackle aesthetic that the orcs have. And I started by painting it black just because some of the primer had rubbed off. Next, I came in with Vallejo Air Steel, a really bright metallic colour, which I was then going to dull down a lot with washes and with rust effects. Again, mixing up my metallic colours, I decided for a sort of coppery, rusty colour on the kind of central block of the engine. Next was gunmetal, again just to kind of break it up because it was quite a lot of one colour at the moment. Next it was onto shades to start to dull this down. I started off with Agrax Earthshade, everyone's favourite, and popped that all over the whole of the engine. Next I switched to Reichland Flesh Shade, focusing this more around the tips of those exhaust pipes and also on the copper block of the engine. So, 6 hours into the paint job, it was finally time to address the Ooge chopper in the room, and starting out, I painted it with gunmetal. With the gunmetal applied, I had a bit of a think, and I decided actually I wanted to bump up the level of yellow on this particular model. I thought that it would really set off the axe head and get people looking that way. I also painted in a few more of the metal details, including the gun that the grot is holding, and any other little bits like the back banner that I was going to paint later on. Heading back to that giant axe, I decided to paint copper in the centres of the kind of flywheels of the chainsaw. And then I went towards the main body, where I coated it in wraithbone in preparation for yellow once again. I used the same technique here that I used on the rest of the yellow armour panels. I made sure to add in some nicks and scratches using my lightest Flash Kits yellow, and also using Agrex Earthshade or Rhinox Hide to make sure that the shades were in the deepest recesses as well. At this stage in the paint job, there wasn't too much more to do. I went over the grot to make sure that he was looking up to scratch, painted the banner and the banner pole, and then added some greys to the base before shading them with a few different shades including greens and reds. And so after 3 different painting sessions and 10 hours total paint time, here's how I did on my Warboss in Mega Armour. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave your comments on what you think I should paint next and how you think I've got on my orcs so far. It's been really fun to kind of switch it up and do a Xenos army for a little bit. In the meantime, my name has been Ollie, this has been my hobby, and I'll see you all next time.